She never made it to her birthday. She never made it to Colorado. She never even made it off the couch. And the man sitting just a few feet away from her, the man who was supposed to love her, would spend the next 13 years telling a story that didn't quite hold together. Tonight, we go inside the disappearance of Caitlyn Markham. And nothing about this case is going to sit right with you. Nothing at all. If this is your first time here, welcome to Midnight Crime. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications, because we drop new cases every week and you do not want to miss what's coming. Like this video if you're already hooked, and drop a comment below. Have you heard of this case before? Let me know. Now let's get into it. To understand what happened on the night of August the 13th, 2011, you have to understand the town first. You have to understand the kind of place that quietly convinces people nothing bad can happen there, the kind of place that lulls you into the belief that the worst things only happen somewhere else, to someone else, in some other kind of life. Fairfield, Ohio is that kind of place. It announces itself without drama. Humid August air that presses against your skin the moment you step outside. The sound of crickets rising after dark. Streets lined with houses that look nearly identical from the curb, all their differences hidden on the inside, behind drawn blinds and closed doors, and lives that only the people living them truly understand. People who grew up there will tell you it was safe. They will use that word without hesitation, because for most of them, it was. It is the kind of suburb that exists in a comfortable agreement with normalcy, where the rhythms of life follow a predictable shape and extraordinary things simply do not happen. And for a long time, for the family of Caitlyn Helen Markham, that was true. Caitlyn was born in Fairfield on August the 16th, 1990. She came into the world, and from her very first breath she was surrounded by love, not the kind that is offered cautiously or conditionally, but the kind that fills a room and changes the temperature of it. Her father, Dave, had chosen adoption. When the call came, he drove to that hospital without hesitation and held his daughter for the first time when she was just 20 minutes old. He sat with her pressed against his chest, and by his own account, he simply could not stop staring at her. Something settled in him in that hospital room. Something locked into place. The world inside those four walls was complete. Outside it, the future was already moving in directions no one could have predicted, but inside that room, in those first quiet minutes, everything was exactly as it should be. She grew up alongside her younger sister, Ollie, who was 4 years her junior. Their parents separated during her childhood, but both remained present. Both remained devoted. That consistency shaped something in Caitlyn, a steadiness, a groundedness that people would describe later in ways that always came back to the same thing. She made people feel safe. She made people feel like they mattered. When you sit with the accounts of everyone who knew Caitlyn Markham, her family, her friends, her teachers, the people who crossed paths with her only briefly and still remembered her years later, you notice something. They all reach for the same words. And then they pause, and something moves across their faces, because they realize those words are not quite sufficient. She made people feel seen. She laughed at her own jokes before she had even finished telling them, the kind of helpless, contagious laugh that sets off everyone else in the room. She was, in the most genuine and unrehearsed sense of the phrase, someone you wanted to be around. But the detail that tells you something true about who she actually was not the version people perform when they are trying to describe someone they've lost, but the real, specific, alive version of her is this. She had paint in her hair almost constantly. Not as a choice, not as an aesthetic. Simply because she forgot it was there. Because she had been so completely absorbed in whatever she was creating that by the time she looked up and came back to the world around her, the paint had already dried and the moment to care about it had already passed. Her sketchbook was on every table she ever occupied. Her camera went everywhere with her. If a particular quality of light caught her eye, the way afternoon sun came through a window at a certain angle, the way shadows gathered at the edges of things, she needed to capture it before it disappeared. Her high school art teacher did not describe her as talented. The word talented would have been too small. What the teacher said was simpler and more precise. This was not a student who was good at art class. This was someone who thought in images. About it too. But if you listened carefully, and some people were beginning to, there was a difference in how she said it. A flatness that had not always been there. A hesitation she had not yet learned to hide, or had given up trying to hide, or had simply stopped caring whether anyone noticed. Because behind the door of that townhouse on Dorscher Drive, things were not what they appeared to be. The relationship that looked, from the outside, like a love story approaching its natural completion had, somewhere along the way, become something else entirely. By June of 2011, Caitlyn had been confiding in a close friend. Carefully. Quietly. In the measured way of someone who has been keeping something inside for a long time and is only just beginning to let it out. What she described was not the relationship that the people around her had been presented with. She talked about the controlling behavior, the way certain freedoms had been slowly and steadily reduced until they were barely freedoms at all. She talked about the jealousy that turned sharp and dangerous the moment she even spoke to another man. She talked about the pressure she had grown exhausted carrying, the weight of it that had become part of her daily life. She told her friend plainly, she no longer loved him. She felt trapped. She had grown far beyond the girl who had walked into this relationship at 16 years old, and the woman she had become did not belong in it anymore. She knew that. She had known it for some time. 3 weeks before she disappeared, there was an incident at a credit union that a stranger would remember for years afterward. Caitlyn went to the GE credit union with John's mother to apply for a card, a routine errand, the kind of thing that takes 20 minutes and is forgotten by the time you reach the parking lot. But at the counter, John's mother made a joke. She would co-sign, she said, but only if Caitlyn promised to take John with her to Colorado. The branch manager laughed. Turned to Caitlyn, expecting the same light response, expecting the moment to pass quickly the way small jokes at bank counters are supposed to. Caitlyn did not laugh. The manager would later describe her expression as somber. Serious in a way that felt completely wrong for the lightness of the moment, like someone standing at a counter going through a necessary motion, while somewhere beneath the surface, they were thinking very clearly about a decision they had not yet said out loud. The application was never completed. They left the counter and they left the building, and the card that Caitlyn Markham would have used to build her independent life in Colorado was never issued. On the evening of August the 13th, 2011, a mutual friend came over to the townhouse on Dorscher Drive. The three of them spent the evening together. He would later tell investigators that Caitlyn barely moved from the couch during the entire visit, laptop balanced on her knees, schoolwork open on the screen, deadlines pressing in. She was quieter than usual. Distant in a way he could not quite name, could not quite find words for. She didn't make her usual jokes. Didn't fill the room the way she normally did, didn't create that warmth that people always noticed the moment she walked into a space. Something was different. He noticed it. He did not know what to do with it. He left around 11:15 that night. He said his goodbyes, stepped through the door, and left her there on that couch, with her laptop, with her dog, with John. It was the last time he would ever see her alive. Somewhere between the last text she sent at 11:36 that night and the moment her phone went dark just after midnight, in that small and quiet window of less than 30 minutes, something happened inside that townhouse on Dorscher Drive that would take 13 years to bring into the light. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment right now and just say "still here." I want to see who is truly following this case with me. And while you're down there, hit that like button. It helps more people find Caitlyn's story. She deserves to be remembered. Now stay with me, because this is where it gets deeply, deeply unsettling. Hi, my name is John Carter. I am calling. I know that you are not supposed to report a missing person before 24 hours, but my fiancée is missing. I cannot find her anywhere. Listen to that call carefully. Not for what he says. For how he says it. The pacing is controlled in a way that does not belong to a person in the grip of real panic. When someone you love has vanished, when you have searched the house and the yard and called every number in your phone and the silence keeps coming back at you from every direction, you do not sound like that. The details arrive in the right order. They are organized. They are clean. They have the particular neatness of something that has been assembled in advance, tested for coherence, checked for gaps. When the dispatcher asks whether the two of them had argued the night before, the answer comes back instantly. Not at all. No pause. No moment of reaching back through the fog of fear and exhaustion to check the memory. The kind of immediate, frictionless response that does not belong to someone trying to remember the truth, it belongs to someone who has already prepared the answer. The hesitation only appears when it should not. On simple factual questions. On the kinds of things a person ought to know without thinking. And then, almost as an aside, before anyone had asked him to account for anyone else, before the investigation had widened even a fraction beyond the front door of that townhouse, John mentioned the Sacred Heart Festival happening just up the street. Lots of strangers in the area, he said. Questionable people. People who did not belong there. He was pointing elsewhere before the search had even begun. Officers arrived at the townhouse and found nothing that looked like a crime scene. No forced entry. No signs of struggle. No broken glass, no overturned furniture, nothing displaced or damaged or out of its ordinary place. The house looked like a house on a quiet Tuesday night when everyone has gone to bed. Caitlyn's purse was on her bed. Her keys were beside it. Her wallet, her ID, her cash all untouched. Her clothes were in her closet. Her shoes were by the door. The only things missing were Caitlyn and her phone. Every single thing she would have needed to go anywhere voluntarily was exactly where she had left it. And her dog was wandering the yard alone. For anyone who knew Caitlyn Markham, that detail landed differently than all the rest. She would not have left him like that. Would not have walked out a door without him accounted for, without him settled and fed and safe. That dog was not an afterthought in her life. He was part of it. That small, quiet fact, a dog alone in a yard in the middle of the night, was, for the people who loved her, the clearest signal that something had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. Fairfield police investigated the festival suggestion thoroughly. They spoke to vendors, to workers, to everyone who had been in the surrounding area that night. They followed every thread that could be followed. It led precisely nowhere. Every person they looked at, they cleared. The Sacred Heart Festival had nothing to do with anything. Which brought them back, as it always would, to the last person who had been alone with her. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Volunteers came by the hundreds. Wooded areas, parks, waterways, old train tracks searched and searched and searched again, until the people searching had memorized the terrain and were beginning again from the beginning. Dave Markham was at the center of all of it, channeling the unbearable energy of a parent who cannot stop moving because stopping means accepting something that he was not prepared to accept, something that every instinct in him refused to accept. A mounted search team came in from Texas. The reward fund grew week by week. The story went national. Reporters arrived. Cameras arrived. And the search continued. John Carter was there too. He was in front of cameras and in the search parties and in every available interview. He called Caitlyn the love of his life. He said he was terrified. He said all he wanted was to take her to Red Lobster for her birthday, the way they had planned, the way she had been looking forward to. He said the right things. He did the right things. He appeared, by every visible measure, to be a man destroyed by the disappearance of the person he loved most. But investigators were watching. And the picture they were building did not match the performance they were observing. Within the first 48 hours, John was brought in for formal questioning. Investigators used a voice stress analyzer, not evidence, not a verdict, but a tool. A way of mapping where the roads lead. A way of knowing which answers belong to truth and which belong to something else. The results gave them a very clear map. When asked whether he knew anything about what had happened to Caitlyn, deception indicated. When asked whether he had been involved, deception indicated again. Not once, not as an anomaly, not as a result that could be attributed to the stress of the situation. Consistently across every question that touched on the night of August the 13th. The instrument did not waver. And then the investigators noticed his neck. Running along the side of it were deep, jagged, angry welts. Red scratches that curved in a way that no electric razor produces regardless of how unsteady the hand holding it, regardless of any explanation that involved shaving. When asked about them, John said they were from shaving. When pressed in a later conversation, the story changed. He said he actually was not sure how he had gotten them. Could not recall. A friend confirmed that he had not noticed any marks on John's neck on the evening of August the 13th. He first noticed them the following day, the morning that Caitlyn was reported missing. Something else was accumulating quietly in the background, detail by detail, in the way that investigations sometimes gather momentum not from dramatic revelations but from the slow, steady weight of things that don't quite fit. A close friend of Caitlyn's told investigators that in those first days after the disappearance, when she spent time with John, she kept noticing something she could not dismiss. He kept referring to Caitlyn in the past tense. Not once, not as a slip of the tongue, not as the kind of accidental lapse that grief can produce in the first raw hours of loss. Repeatedly. Naturally. The way language settles into truth before the person speaking it has decided to acknowledge that truth out loud. She had been missing for less than 48 hours. And he was already speaking about her as though she belonged to the past. Dave Markham had sensed it even earlier. From the very first phone call, from the moment John screamed into the receiver that Caitlyn was missing, Dave noticed the shape of what was not there. John never asked, "Have you seen her?" Never asked, "Did she call you? Is she with you? Do you know where she might have gone?" He never asked. He announced. From the moment he screamed in my ear, Dave would later say, I did not believe him. He deleted the texts to free up space, he said. Because he was receiving so many messages from concerned friends the following day. It was 2011. Smartphones did not work that way. The excuse collapsed under the weight of its own logic the moment it left his mouth. And Caitlyn's phone, the phone that might have told its own story, that might have held the last word she ever typed, was never found. Not then. Not ever. The town kept searching. The cameras kept rolling. John Carter kept showing up, kept speaking, kept performing the role of the devastated fiancé in a case that publicly had no suspects and no answers. But the voice stress map had its roads clearly marked. The scratches had been photographed. 2 phones had gone silent at the exact same moment. And a father who had held his daughter when she was just 20 minutes old already knew, in the way that grief sometimes knows before the evidence catches up, exactly what had happened to her. The case, for now, had nowhere left to go. So it did what cold cases do. It waited. The news cycle moves fast. Within weeks of Caitlyn's disappearance, the cameras that had filled the streets of Fairfield began appearing less and less frequently. The national coverage thinned. Other stories came along, they always do, and the weight of attention that had briefly pressed down on this case began to lift. The reward fund kept growing. The flyers stayed up. But the world, in its relentless forward motion, had largely moved on. Dave Markham had not moved anywhere. He was still there in the search parties, at the community meetings, in front of anyone who would listen. He had helped establish a new chapter of Texas EquiSearch, the volunteer organization that had sent teams into Fairfield's fields and forests during the initial search. Where others had once searched for Caitlyn, Dave now helped search for other people's daughters, channeling the unbearable energy of a father with nowhere left to put it. He drove roads he had already driven 100 times. He looked into ditches he had already looked into. He could not stop, because stopping felt like abandonment, and abandonment was something he was constitutionally incapable of. Meanwhile, John Carter continued appearing on camera. He gave interviews. He participated in vigils. He stood beside Dave at community events and spoke about Caitlyn in careful, measured sentences. And there were no tears. Something that the people around him began to notice and quietly file away. A lawyer who had known the family since 2011, a woman named Tina Barrett, would later say it plainly: she had watched John Carter for years. Through all the public appearances and all the appeals and all the searching, she had never once seen him cry. Not until he was afraid. In September of 2011, 1 month after Caitlyn vanished, John Carter sat down for a formal polygraph examination. He did not pass. Polygraph results are not admissible in court. They are not proof of guilt or innocence. But they gave investigators something: a shape, a direction, a sense of where the inconsistencies lived. And in John's case, the inconsistencies lived in every question that touched the night of August the 13th. The examiner noted deception. Investigators noted it too. But noting something and proving something are separated by a distance that, in this case, would take years to cross. By the middle of 2012, a new lead briefly surfaced. A man named Garrett Kong had been indicted on a sexual battery charge for an assault on a woman in Oxford, Ohio. Because he lived and worked just blocks from Caitlyn's townhouse, near a gas station at the end of her street, investigators looked at him seriously. The community latched onto it with the desperate energy of people who needed an answer, any answer, after months of silence. Fairfield police investigated thoroughly. And then they cleared him completely. Dave Markham would later describe running into Kong at that same gas station sometime after the investigation had closed. Kong saw him across the counter, recognized him, and his shoulders dropped. He looked at Dave and said simply, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Dave said it broke his heart, because it should never have been him. As more people came forward in the months following the disappearance, a portrait of the relationship began to emerge that contradicted almost everything John had said publicly. Friends described a Caitlyn who had been quietly, privately unhappy for months, worn down by John's controlling behavior, his drug use, the pressure he applied behind closed doors that he was careful never to show in public. One friend said Caitlyn had told her plainly in June of 2011 that she no longer loved him. That she felt trapped. That Colorado which John spoke about constantly and with great enthusiasm was his plan, not hers. She had been putting away money, making arrangements, quietly preparing. He had been spending. She had been preparing to leave a relationship. He had been preparing to relocate it. The distance between those two realities, investigators were beginning to understand, was where this case actually lived. But distance is not evidence. And evidence was precisely what they did not have. Spring arrived in 2013. Then April. On the 7th of that month, a couple was making their way along the creek banks off Big Cedar Road in Cedar Grove, Indiana, roughly 30 miles east of Fairfield, just across the state line. They were searching for scrap metal, familiar with the land, comfortable in the kind of rural quiet that most people never encounter. When they came across what appeared to be a pile of discarded debris wrapped in black plastic sheeting, they might have walked past it. They didn't. Inside the sheeting, partially exposed, was a jawbone. They called 911. Franklin County Sheriff's deputies and Indiana State Police responded and cordoned the area. What they found spread across the dump site, not buried, not concealed with any particular care, but layered under trash as though simply discarded, were the skeletal remains of a young woman. Dental records confirmed it within days. The remains belonged to Caitlyn Markham. She had been missing for 20 months. The forensic examination that followed was careful and methodical, and in several ways deeply disturbing. The bones showed no signs of having been buried at this location. The body had been dumped here, transported, investigators believed, possibly moved from somewhere else entirely. The skull had been found separately, inside a tied plastic bag. The medical examiner determined that the head had not decomposed inside that bag. It had been placed there after significant decomposition had already occurred elsewhere, meaning that someone had returned to wherever Caitlyn's remains had first been left, and moved them. On the bones of her left wrist, forensic anthropologists identified 3 to 4 sharp force wounds, a precise, V-shaped incision that had shaved the surface of the bone. Not consistent with any accident. Not consistent with any natural process. The coroner ruled the death a homicide. The cause of death could not be determined. When a local reporter reached out to John Carter for comment after the discovery, his response came by text message. He wrote that he had only been in front of cameras before because he wanted to find Caitlyn. Now that was done, he said. He had no interest in putting himself on camera anymore. He just wanted to mourn his loss and try to put his life back together. No rage at whoever had done this. No demand for answers. No mention of justice for the woman he had called the love of his life. Just a desire to move on. Dave Markham read that and felt something harden in him that had been hardening since the night of the very first phone call. That scream. That announcement. That absence of the questions a genuinely worried person naturally asks. He had watched John stand beside him at vigils and searches and memorials, knowing what he now believed with complete certainty. He was not going to let this case sit. In 2015, Dave lobbied the Butler County Sheriff's Office directly, pushed for the investigation to be transferred away from the Fairfield Police Department, which had run out of runway, and into new hands that might find new angles. The Butler County Sheriff agreed. Fresh investigators came in. Tens of boxes of case files were opened and re-examined from the beginning. A neighbor of Caitlyn's had also come forward. On the night of August the 13th, she said, she had heard voices from the townhouse. Muffled. Confrontational. And beneath them one word, repeated. No. Again and again. Digital forensics told another part of the story. John Carter's phone showed 15 consecutive hours of complete inactivity beginning in the early morning of August the 14th, the exact window during which investigators calculated that a body would have needed to be transported 30 miles across a state line and deposited along Big Cedar Road. 15 hours of silence from the phone of a man who publicly claimed to have spent that entire day desperately trying to reach his missing fiancée. In January of 2021, John Carter sat down for his third polygraph examination. On the standard scale, 0 indicates no deception. -3 is considered significant. John Carter scored -25. The examiner said it was not even close, that the chart simply did not behave this way for people telling the truth. The specific questions that produced the most extreme responses were those that asked whether John had disposed of Caitlyn's body at Big Cedar Road. When investigators raised these results with John's mother, Karen, and asked why her son kept failing these examinations, she told them that Jeffrey Dahmer had passed his polygraph. She said it as a defense, as though it settled something. The investigator replied quietly that he was not talking about Jeffrey Dahmer. He was talking about her son. And then he said something directly to John in one of their final interviews that landed in that room and stayed there. I have interviewed 1,000 people. Homicides, assaults, trespasses. I have never in my career interviewed a psychopath. The day you walked out of that room, I turned to my colleague and said that was the first one. On March the 22nd, 2023, body camera footage captured the moment John Carter was taken into custody at his place of work. He stepped outside and the officers were waiting. And what the camera caught in that first unguarded second before the performance could reassemble itself was the face of a man who had spent 12 years certain this moment would never arrive. Not shock. Not indignation. Something closer to the particular collapse of someone watching the structure they built, brick by careful brick, finally give way. He was charged with 2 counts of murder. He said there was no physical evidence. The officer acknowledged that there was not much direct physical evidence. But there was, the officer said, a considerable amount of everything else. John asked for a lawyer. There is one more account offered later, secondhand, the kind of testimony courts handle carefully because it passed through another person before it arrived. An inmate who had spoken with John while he awaited trial said that John had described in private what happened in that townhouse on the night of August the 13th, 2011. An argument. Caitlyn on the ground. His hands. The silence that followed. And then not panic, not accident but a decision. A deliberate decision to make it look like something she had done to herself. Whether that account is true in every detail, only John Carter knows. But it aligned with uncomfortable precision with the wound on her wrist, the words found later, and 12 years of a man who never once, in public, asked who had done this to the woman he claimed to love. After his arrest, John Carter posted a $1 million bond and walked out of jail. He went home. He wore a GPS monitor on his ankle. And he continued, for over a year, to live his life, the same life he had been living for 12 years while Caitlyn's family prepared for a trial that everyone who had waited this long had decided they were ready for. More than 50 people were subpoenaed by the prosecution. Evidence was organized. Witnesses were prepared. June of 2024 was circled on every calendar that mattered. 3 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin, John Carter's defense team contacted the prosecutor's office. They were offering a deal. When asked later who had made the first move, the prosecutor confirmed it plainly: the defense came to them. Not the other way around. And those who had been watching John Carter since 2011, who had studied the architecture of his behavior across 13 years, understood immediately what that meant. Tina Barrett said it without hesitation: he would not have walked into that courtroom and offered a plea unless he believed he was going to receive probation. He had spent 13 years avoiding accountability. He intended to spend the next phase of his life doing the same. On a Friday in June of 2024, John Carter stood in a Butler County courtroom and entered a guilty plea to a single count of involuntary manslaughter and unintentional killing committed during the course of a misdemeanor assault. Not murder. Not the deliberate, calculated act that the evidence and the timeline and the phone records and the scratches and the 20 months of silence all pointed toward. A misdemeanor assault gone wrong. That was the legal frame. That was what 13 years of a missing woman, a father who never stopped, a community that searched fields in the dark, and a shed full of matching plastic sheeting had been reduced to. Dave Markham was sitting in that courtroom when the plea was entered. He said later that he was shaking, that he was so angry he could barely sit still. That John Carter had 13 years. 13 years to say it was an accident. 13 years to say anything. To give Caitlyn's family the one thing they had asked for: more than justice, more than a conviction, an explanation. Instead, he waited until 3 weeks before a jury would have heard everything. And then he made a deal designed to minimize his exposure. He received 6 more weeks of freedom while he waited for sentencing. 6 more weeks. After 13 years. It doesn't seem right, Dave said. Because it isn't. The sentencing hearing arrived in the summer of 2024. John Carter stood before Judge Dan Hoy and said nothing. His attorneys had argued for probation, no prison time at all for the man whose shed had contained the plastic sheeting that matched the wrapping around Caitlyn's remains, whose polygraph score had registered at -25, whose phone had gone silent for 15 hours on the morning her body needed to be moved. Probation. As though the appropriate response to all of it was supervision and a check-in schedule. Judge Hoy rejected it. He said that anything short of the maximum sentence would demean the seriousness of what John Carter had done and the impact it had carried for 13 years. He sentenced John Carter to 36 months in state prison, the maximum permitted under Ohio law for a third-degree felony involuntary manslaughter conviction. 36 months. 3 years. For a woman who had been gone for 13. Dave delivered his victim impact statement. He stood in that courtroom and asked the judge to let John Carter feel even a fraction of the pain that Caitlyn's family had carried since August of 2011. Michelle Feist, who had been Caitlyn's closest friend, also spoke. She said it was good, in some way, to finally know the truth. But then she paused. Really? What is the truth? She said. We still don't even know exactly what happened. And he is still, in some way, denying it. Because that was the other thing. John Carter stood in that courtroom and said nothing. Not a word of explanation. Not a single sentence directed at the people sitting in those seats who had spent 13 years waiting. When given the opportunity to speak to account, even minimally, for what he had done, he chose silence. The same silence he had maintained since the night Caitlyn's phone went dark. He did cry, leaving court. Tears. Finally. The first anyone had seen from him in 13 years of vigils and searches and memorials and media appearances. Tina Barrett watched him and said what she had been thinking for years. John Carter cries when he is afraid. In 2011, when he was spinning his story, he was neither afraid nor sad. He is now. What happened in the hallway outside that courtroom defied expectation, even for people who had long since stopped being surprised by John Carter. His attorney stood before reporters and made a statement. He said, on behalf of his client, that John Carter, notwithstanding the guilty plea, had nothing to offer the Markham family about what had actually happened to Caitlyn. And then he said that John Carter was asking the Markham family to go out and find the real person responsible. The real person. After a guilty plea. After the shed. After -25 on a polygraph scale that ends at -3. After 13 years. Find the real person. Dave Markham was standing a few feet away when those words were spoken. John's mother, Karen, was also in the hallway. She looked in the direction of the man whose daughter had been wrapped in plastic from her own shed, and said that she had always adored Caitlyn. That she had always known they had a good relationship. Dave listened to all of it. That was the most bizarre thing I have ever heard, he said afterward. Those were lies. That was delusional. Some months later, John Carter applied for early release, having served roughly half of his 3-year sentence and having been noted as a model inmate. The request came before the court. Judge Hoy denied it. John Carter would serve his full sentence. There are charges that were never filed and can never be filed now. Ohio's statute of limitations on tampering with evidence and desecration of a corpse is 6 years. By the time investigators had enough to act on those specific offenses, the clock had already run out. The man who moved her body, who placed her head in a separate bag, who drove 30 miles across a state line in the early morning hours, that conduct will never be prosecuted. There is also the question of a second person, a redacted name in the search warrant affidavit, an individual investigators believe helped dispose of Caitlyn's remains. That person has never been charged. The full truth of what happened in the hours after midnight on August 13, 2011, may never be fully known. John Carter has not offered it. He has not tried. He has offered no explanation, Dave said. And even if he wrote a confession in prison, he would have to be more convincing than he has been for the last 13 years. Near Caitlyn's home, there is a park. In the park, there is a tree. People call it Caitlyn's butterfly tree. In the days before sentencing, Dave and Tina Barrett gathered supporters there, not to protest, not to rage, but to focus. To write letters to Judge Hoy. To channel 13 years of grief and fury into something constructive. Something that Caitlyn herself, who spent her life making things, creating things, turning feeling into form, might have recognized. Butterflies. Because that is what she loved. Because Dave has said that in the worst of the early years, when the weight of not knowing was almost unbearable, a butterfly would sometimes come and circle him. And he would think, there she is. She was bright and vibrant and coming out of her shell. Like a caterpillar becoming something more. She was just getting started. Dave Markham and Tina Barrett are now working to pass what they call Caitlyn's Law legislation that would extend the statute of limitations in cases where a missing person investigation becomes a homicide investigation. The clock, the law would say, should start when the homicide is confirmed. Not when the person first disappears. So that the next family cannot be robbed of charges the way this family was. So that the next person responsible cannot simply wait and hide and let time do the work for them. It would be, as Dave put it, so like Caitlyn still helping people even now. Still making something out of what was broken. She would have been an extraordinary woman. Her father knows it. Her sister knows it. The art teacher who recognized her gift before she did knows it. Everyone who ever sat beside her and felt, inexplicably, like the most seen person in the room, they all know it. She had paint in her hair and a sketchbook on every table and a future she had earned. And it was taken from her by someone who slept in the same house as the evidence for 12 years and called it nothing. 3 years for all of that. The butterfly tree is still there. Dave still visits it. And somewhere in whatever form love takes when it outlasts the person it belongs to, so is she. If Caitlyn's story moved you tonight, and I believe it did, please do something with that feeling right now. Like this video. Share it. Put her name somewhere new. Subscribe to Midnight Crime if you haven't already, and hit that notification bell, because every week we come back with another case that deserves to be remembered. Leave a comment below and tell me what moment in this story hit you hardest. I read every single one. Caitlyn Markham was 20 years old with paint in her hair and everything ahead of her. She deserved so much more than 3 years. Say her name. And I will see you in the next case.